What's up, Raider Nation? Jesse Merrick here, coming to you from the field at Allegiant Stadium following the Raiders' home opening loss to the Chargers. They fall 20-9 in this one. And look, the major disappointment in this one, I guess, is Geno Smith. Obviously, he did not have the game that he had in the opener. And as you really start to dive into it, he just looked off from the start, all right? This was a tough game for him overall. He goes 24 for 43, 180 yards, no touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. I think the big issue in this one is the fact that the offense just really kept trying to push the ball down the field when it wasn't there. They weren't really in a rhythm overall on offense. And it's crazy when you look at the stats. Geno was 0 for 12 on passes of 10 yards or more down the field and had 3 interceptions in those situations. When we talked to Pete Carroll after the game, he said that he wasn't really happy with the way that they tried to push the ball down the field too much. He wanted to see them maybe dump it off underneath a little bit more and maybe let their guys go run and pick up the first downs that way. And I think that would have helped this team get into more of a rhythm. You know, Geno also mentioned that, at times he might have been striving and trying to, fit it into some windows that necessarily weren't there. But, he's a guy that's confident in his arm. So he's going to make some of those tight window throws. We did see that in the game against New England. And obviously right from the jump, that first one on the lookie there to Trey, gets picked off, never gets batted up in the air. So that's just something I think that Geno may live and die by because he's got so much, trust in his arm. So that's something that fans are going to have to live with. Now, obviously, it's not going to be to that extent. They did say it in the first game. Geno's a 70% guy, and he was that in the first game. Obviously, not in this game. Finishes with a quarterback rating of 37. Obviously, not great at all. But when you just digest this, he didn't look right from the start and looked like he was pressing at times. He was high on a lot of throws, sailing them. During the week, obviously, we knew that maybe he was dealing with a bit of a hamstring issue, from the previous game against the Patriots. He got hit when he took off and run. But Pete said afterwards that he was healthy. He made it through fine, all the tests and everything like that. So he said that wasn't an issue. But as you watch the game, it just felt like something was off, overall. Maybe it's the way it started. And obviously, again, the Chargers able to sit back in their defense. They play a lot of too high shell. Geno noted this is a team that's going to play zone like 90% of the time. And that's exactly what they did for the most part in this game. They brought pressure, got home when they did it. The offensive line didn't play well. You could tell by the play calling too. I think overall Chip couldn't really trust, what they were doing. Again, they take those shots. They had 12 passes of 10 yards or more down the field. And Geno did make a point to try and push it down the field. But we just didn't see it, I think, consistently in terms of the protection and those 5-step drops and stuff like that a lot throughout the game. There was a lot of times where it was either the deep shot or, right to the sideline in the short game. I think we saw when they came out of the half a little more of an impetus on trying to attack the intermediate areas of the field. And that's something we needed to see much more out of the Raiders in this game, I think, throughout the entire game as a whole. And that's just something that wasn't there. It was a bit of a head-scratcher for me in the way this one was called. And again, when your quarterback's not playing well, what do you got to do? Well, you got to run the football, and they didn't really do that. There was only 19 carries on the day for the Raiders in the running game. Ashton Jeanty has 11 of them. And I was really scratching my head, with how they were using him in the rushing game. And Pete did say afterwards that they're breaking him in. It's only his second game in the NFL. So there is that, but I just don't like bringing a guy who you take that high in the draft along and taking that kind of breaking him in mindset. Through the first 2 weeks of the season, I believe he's actually got the lowest yards per touch, or he's in the top 3 lowest yards per touch of running backs, in recent years. He's averaging 2.4 yards per touch. And I don't think it's necessarily all on him. Obviously, the offensive line hasn't been great. There's a lot of times he's getting the ball, and then dudes are right in his lap, so there's not a lot you can do in those situations. I will say it looked like he was kind of getting things going and moving in the right direction right before the half. He picks up 16 yards on 2 carries, back-to-back carries for him, and then they pull him out of the game for the most part, and they finished with Zamir White and Dylan Laube on the last drive there. And I know Laube is like your scat back, so I get it. But I don't know how you can trust him more than you would trust Jeanty in those situations. That's the thing that's a bit of a head-scratcher for me. Jeanty's a guy that you take 6th overall. Like, you got to have him in there those situations. And he's a guy that showed that he can be a pass catcher out of the backfield. He did it at Boise his junior year. He was number 1 in the country in terms of, his second to last season there at Boise. He was number 1 in the country in terms of receiving yards by a running back. So this is a guy that did it at a high clip. Chip was very complimentary of his game as a receiver out of the backfield. So to me, it was a head scratcher to go out there and throw Laube into the backfield that consistently. Again, I just think you lean on a guy that is Jeanty, who's one of your top dogs, or at least should be, because as you look at this offense, it should be a 3-headed attack. It should be Jacoby, it should be Brock, it should be Jeanty. You hit those three, and we kind of saw that a bit coming out of the halftime there. And so I thought, okay, they're going to start feeding those guys. Obviously, that ended up not being the case. So that, to me, is something when they go back to the drawing board. Maybe just simplify things. And again, don't make it like deep or we're attacking the edges on these swing passes and stuff like that. You got to have a little bit more in the tank there. And again, to me, it was crazy how quickly they seemed to move off of Jeanty and the run game as a whole. I mean, look, this team is built to run the football, and how are you only going to have 19 carries on the day? So that's something to me that was a bit of a head scratcher for the way the game was called. And you again have to get your quarterback into a rhythm. And I know with some of these throws to the sideline and things like that, they were trying to get that going. It wasn't quite there. Also, let's be realistic about how aggressive these Chargers DBs were being. You know, they were coming downhill on all these throws, jumping some of them. Probably should have mixed in some more double moves and things like that. And I get that's a bit, contradictory because the protection wasn't quite there. But mix something in, maybe a sluggo, just different things like that we didn't quite see in this game. So, again, one of those games where I kind of scratching my head a bit about the way that Chip went calling it. Again, when your quarterback isn't playing well, you should be running the ball better or at least showing more, of a concentration to run the ball when you do have a kid that you drafted 6th overall in the draft this year. So just a bit strange the way Jeanty was used overall. But again, this is one that you do put on Geno. And, I know a lot of people are going to be ripping him in this one, and rightfully so. As you go and look through it, that pass there to Trey, he tries to fit it into the window, gets batted up, then eventually, again, does go and get picked off there. On the throw down in the red zone to Jacoby, it was a cover 2. By the book, that's the right throw to make, but Derwin James is carrying Jacoby on that seam route in there. So personnel-wise, you probably don't want to try and go against a Derwin James. And I get that they had the wide safeties. Maybe manipulate them a little bit more. If you're going to make that throw, look more outside towards Brock and see if you can draw that safety out towards Brock there, and then kind of up and over the top and put a little more air under it to Jacoby so he has a bit of a chance where it's like my guy or nobody's going to get it. There was also Thornton. Look, the safety was shaded toward his side, but I think maybe he's running a bit more towards the sideline, and you throw it, again, where only he can get it, a bit of an over-the-shoulder type of catch there. So just didn't like that decision either. And I think, again, Chip didn't love it too much either. And you go and look earlier in the game as well when they're going down there. They end up kicking the field goal. It was 3rd down and I think 6 or 3rd and 6 initially. Geno takes off, takes that big hit, and then Parham gets called for holding, I believe, if I remember it right. And that really changed the game to me because I think if that play stands, Geno takes up, they go for it. That's 4-down territory to me. They're going for a touchdown there. But then given the situation with it being 3rd and long, the way things panned out on that drive, like you have to kick the field goal. You got to play defense. The defense was playing well enough, I think. I mean, look, at the end of the day, they hold this Chargers offense to only 20 points. The weapons that this offense does have, and I know I and many other people have said out there that they don't have like a true number 1 in the receiving core outside of Brock, and I do think that's a fair thing to be able to say. Not to say that Jacoby's not a good receiver, and Trey Tucker, we've seen him at times as well, and also Dante Thornton has had his moments too. It's just they don't have that guy that you can trust to win down in and down out outside of Brock, and obviously he's a bit on the mend in this game. So I think in those situations, just make it easier on yourself. You know what I mean? And so you got to be able to make the right reads and all of that. And so in that situation, again, kick the field goal, live to play another day, and you hope that the defense is going to do better. But they should be scoring more than, 9 points in this game. Obviously not great on the day for them. So that to me is kind of how I break all of this down. You have to look at Geno, and again, it all begins and ends with that aspect of it because like I noted, and Pete even said it, he thinks that this defense played very well, and I would definitely agree with him on that fact. I mean, look, the rush wasn't necessarily there at the clip that I expected it to be, and that I think many of you would like to see as well. Max Crosby obviously didn't flash as much as you would hope against a guy like Pipkins, who didn't fare too well against the Chiefs. I mean, that right side of their offensive line was one of the few areas that did kind of struggle a bit. But today in this game, whether the Raiders were blitzing, whether they weren't blitzing, that offensive line just really seemed to handle it. And Herbert, I think, fared very well in terms of using the pocket and breaking contain, sometimes on the edge, and then also right up the middle, too. His rushing attack was a scary one for the Raiders to have to handle, and I don't think they did a great job against that as well. Also, Pete noted the fact that, for the most part, they did pretty well, against these receivers, and I agree with them on that. Their corners made some plays, especially early on. You go back and look at the 60-yard bomb, excuse me, there to Quentin Johnston. They were in cover 3. That's on Caillou. I think if I go back and look at it when I was watching it, it looked like he thought the crosser was coming his way. He took his eyes off the receiver and kind of sat a little bit, tried to recover too late. So that's on him. He's in cover 3. He's supposed to be covering that deep third there. But also, Polamalu, he's in the middle of that, like, free safety center fielder type of role there. I'd like to see a little bit more out of him, too. Help your guy out, be over the top a little bit more. And, yes, maybe it still goes for a big gain, but it doesn't go for a touchdown. Other than that, again, for the most part, I was pretty impressed with the defense. I think Herbert just made some really solid throws, really solid plays, and the way he was able to move around in the pocket. So it's one of those deals where you kind of scratch your head a bit. Now, one of the positives I will say is overall, again, just a tough outing for the Raiders in this game. Jamal Adams, though, plays one hell of a game. Anytime that he's out there, I've been really impressed with him, whether it's setting the edge and maybe not having that, like, bam, collisioning guys and smashing them back, but at least being able to hold the edge to force the run play in. There was one play in particular where I noticed that, but he just always seems to be around the ball. So I think the more they get Jamal Adams involved, the better. So that's definitely a win, at least one positive you can walk away from this game feeling good about. But again, overall, just not great. And again, this is one that I do put on the offense. I'm over here looking at the stats, just kind of going through it. You look at it, Jacoby has 6 receptions for 68 yards, Brock Bowers 5 for 38 yards. Then after that, nobody else has more than 3 catches. But in terms of like a yardage total, Dante Thornton's the next highest receiver with only 20 yards. I mean, that tells you the story of the game right there. And targets-wise, it just wasn't all that great either. Even though I guess, look, they did actually target Trey Tucker a lot. So that's something to take note of there. It just they couldn't convert. And again, the biggest issue in this game was the fact that the deep ball is not something that converted well for them. We saw them do that at such a high clip, and that is why they had success. Against this Chargers defense, they're going to sit back. They're going to keep everything in front of them. And when you're not able to run the ball and you're just throwing it deep and they're able to keep it all in front of them, like, that's going to be an issue, obviously. And that's exactly what happened for the Raiders. And so this is one of those ones where I think we all thought it was a prove-it game for the Raiders coming into it, a big opportunity to start the season 2-0. They obviously don't get that done. They now fall to 1-1 and head to Washington, needing a win against a team that's really good. Obviously, there's some questions about Jaden Daniels and his availability. He is questionable right now. We'll be monitoring that as the week goes on. But just Pete even said it when he walked up to the podium. It feels like a big missed opportunity for the Raiders in this game. Again, 20 points is what you hold the Chargers to. You should be able to score more than 20 points with this offense, with the guys that they do have there, especially with Chip Kelly calling the plays and with a Geno Smith guy that we saw ball out in the first game. So that was obviously not the case tonight, as we noted. He just looked off from the get-go, couldn't quite shake it the rest of the game, and the offense as a whole just wasn't in a rhythm. So I'm real curious to see how the Raiders come out of this one. One of the things I would really like to see going forward, and I know you guys would as well, more usage of Ashton Jeanty. Forget this whole breaking him in thing. You drafted him so high. You want to run the ball. I know that blocking hasn't necessarily been there, but feed him, bank on that. We also didn't see them run a ton of 12 personnel today. As we have talked about all week long, Brock Bowers obviously dealing with some stuff there. But I would have liked to see more 12 personnel and just try and pound the rock. Don't get too cute. Even on those, like, second and shorts, so many times we saw them take that deep shot. And I get it because you still have the opportunity on third down. But, like, again, just don't get too cute. Just run it. Make it happen. Pick up the first down and live to play another day, especially when you're not in a rhythm. So it's kind of like a Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from what we saw. Obviously, the second half in the first game against the Patriots was much better. They were moving. They had the play action passing game going, and they were able to hit those intermediates and all those deep shots at such a high clip. And we saw the very efficient Geno tonight. Obviously not the case. Everything just off for them in that Raiders offense. So got to clean things up in a big way. Pete did say that they came out of this one fairly good, fairly healthy. So hopefully Brock is going to take a step in the right direction in terms of the health of that knee going forward, get more usage out of him, which is also kind of crazy to say because he does have 12 targets in this game. So they did use him a lot. But you could tell game planning wise, they didn't want to go to him too much and test him a ton. So, for the Raiders' sake, hopefully he's healthy. And then again, I always go back to this. I was talking to the press box up to a couple of the other guys in there. And I remember a couple of years ago when the Raiders had Darren Waller, they had Dante. They had Darren Waller, they had Devontae Adams is what I'm trying to say, and they also had Josh Jacobs. And it was one of those deals where, that was their three-headed attack. And Andy Reid said, like, that's their three-headed monster. Those are the guys that you have to slow down. Well, it may not be the same style of guys, and obviously Jeanty has to show that, but their three-headed weapon, and I mentioned it a little earlier here on the podcast, is Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers, and then Ashton Jeanty. Like, get those three guys going, get them involved early and often. And like I said, we saw that a bit coming out of the half. Need to see that more against this Commanders team And look, we saw how hard it was to contain Herbert. Obviously, it's going to be real tough to do that against a Jaden Daniels guy as well, who pretty good at football, pretty good on the move. Again, his health is going to be a bit of an issue there, so we're going to be monitoring that throughout the week. But need to see a little bit more out of the guys on the front there defensively. I've been very high on them and talking them up a ton. Need to see them get home a bit more and impact the game more to help the guys on the back end. But Jaden Daniels, again, another one of those guys in the league that's going to make those tough plays. So it's not getting any easier for the Raiders. Now you do have to go on the road, and it's way too early to talk about must-win games or anything like that. But this is going to be a big one against a Commanders team that has been up and down throughout the year and now dealing with some injuries at a very important position for them. So real curious to see, like I said, how they come out in the following game. Obviously, guys, we'll have coverage for you from here in Vegas before we hit the road. And we will be out there in Washington for that game. So, make sure you follow along on Twitter at JesseSBSN. Also on this channel as well, we'll have our podcast coming out next Thursday, obviously, this Thursday, because this game was on Monday night. This podcast is actually going to serve as our Tuesday podcast that normally drops at 11 a.m. We'll be having more for you throughout the week. We'll try and bring a guest on that can give you a good perspective of the Commanders and kind of what they bring to the table and maybe where the Raiders will have a little bit of an advantage in that one. Obviously, it's tough to see where the advantages lie after a game like this when you only score 9 points and it looks this discombobulated on offense. But moving forward, you hope for better things from the Raiders, and there's only one thing you can do is try and get better from this one. So we'll see how it is. You just chalk this one up as a stinker from, Geno Smith, and you hope that this isn't who he is. You hope he's, somewhere in the middle between the first game and this one. And if you can do that, I think you're going to play a lot better as a team, and you're going to get things rolling. But need to see more out of Chip moving forward. Need to see more out of Jeanty. As I noted, and I'm kind of repeating myself here, but just want to hammer it home for the simple fact that, you have to feed Jeanty. You have to commit to the running game, and we just haven't seen that willingness from them to do that so far. So that's going to be something to pay attention to going forward for the Raiders. With that, guys, like I said, we will have our next podcast for you on Thursday at 11 a.m. Make sure you tune in for that. Also on our next newsletter coming out Wednesday morning at 6 a.m. Make sure you go to silverandblacksportsnetwork.com to subscribe to that. For now, that's all we got for you. So we'll catch you later, guys. Have a good one.